Hi, my name's Maria and welcome back to my channel, Maria Might Read That. And today I am doing a wrap up of my November reads for Once Upon a Readathon, which was a fairy tale themed readathon that Hannah Blackwell created. And I was one of the hosts for Team Fairy Godmothers. And as I mentioned, it was a fairy tale themed readathon. So we were kind of completing our own fairy tale by following different steps and trying to get to the apple tree for eternal life. I did manage to complete my journey to the apple tree and get my magical apple, and I'm going to talk about all the books that I read during the different steps of that kind of fairy tale process. I had a really great reading month. I enjoyed pretty much every book that I read, and I got a lot of goals checked off, which was kind of also in part because I was also participating in Knock It Out November, which was a goals themed readathon, very kind of relaxed, created by Covers with Cassidy. And the general idea of it was you just set yourself some goals to knock out and you tried to knock them out throughout the month. My main goals were that I wanted to just continue or kind of catch up on ongoing series, finish off some series, and then I wanted to work on reducing my physical TBR as well. So I read a lot of books that I owned physically, and I feel like I did pretty well as far as both of those goals go. Starting it off with step one, which was learn the history of the apple tree. I read 2 books for this step to kind of cover different prompts. The first one was A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. This is book 2 in the Monk and Robot novella series that she has going on. And essentially it's set in kind of a sci-fi futuristic world where there were robots that had become kind of an integral part of society until they rose up and just abandoned their kind of jobs that they had taken over, and human society had to kind of readapt to doing things themselves. And our main character kind of goes on a journey of self-exploration, and along the way meets one of these robots, and they're both kind of exploring each other, exploring life's different questions, and trying to kind of figure out their own purpose in all of it. And it's just kind of a very almost thematic driven novella series. The first book, A Psalm for the Wild Bit, is one of my favorite reads of the year. 5 stars. It just really emotionally kind of gut punched me and really said the things that I needed it to say in that right moment. It was very much kind of talking about themes of purpose again, and just kind of finding meaning in life, and just things that I, in the place that I was when I read it, really needed to hear and kind of really connected with. The second book didn't quite hit me on that same emotional level, so I am giving it 4 stars. It was just a really enjoyable, cozy read. I'd say that the first one had a kind of a clear message that I was trying to convey, and it's a message that I in particular really connected with. The second book didn't really do that, but it was just a very comfy, kind of cozy read. Becky Chambers, I think, is known for that kind of slice of life, kind of being with the characters, coming on their adventures, and it's just the way she writes is very just, again, cozy and comforting. And I just really enjoyed being in her world. My biggest takeaway from this book is that I need to read more Becky Chambers next year, and so I'm really excited for that. But yeah, again, 4 stars. Still really enjoying this novella series. And this was the latest release, so I am now caught up to date on this. And I used A Prayer for the Crown Shy for the Once Upon a Time prompt. Then I have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a standalone, kind of very wintry, atmospheric fairy tale retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. It's marketed as kind of Miriam's story, and she's the daughter of a Jewish family, and her father is a moneylender in this town, but he has always been almost too soft-hearted to really collect on his debts, and so she takes over the family business, and she finds a way to kind of, as the phrase goes, turn silver into gold, and catches the attention of a Starrock, which is kind of an ice fae of another realm, and he comes to her and wants her to turn silver into gold for him. Having read this, I will say that this actually really much feels like the story of 3 women. There's also Wanda, who has a very abusive drunkard father, and he essentially makes her life a living hell. So there are trigger warnings for domestic abuse and just a really tough situation there. And Wanda and her brothers are trying to kind of find a way to survive amidst this, and she ends up crossing paths with Miriam and her family. And then we also have Irina, who is the daughter of a duke in another town, but he has always not valued her. Her father has always kind of treated her as only having worth for whatever marriage alliance that they can make, and she catches the attention of the Tsar, which is the king of this land, and so she kind of gets embroiled in that. All 3 storylines cross over. All 3 of them have things to do with each other, and it's a beautiful story of feminism and the way that these 3 women kind of see each other, understand each other, sympathize with each other, even though they're coming from completely different worlds and backgrounds, and the way that they end up supporting each other through different kind of obstacles in their way. This book has a little bit of romance. It's not very heavy, so wouldn't go into it expecting a big romance focus, but just there is a little bit of it toward the end that kind of gets hinted at. I've just realized that I had the book and could have been holding it up this whole time, and that editing Maria will hate me for having to put in the image when I have the book, but I also don't want to give that synopsis again, so we're rolling with it. Sorry, editing future Maria. This book, on the one hand, feels very similar to Naomi Novik's Uprooted in the sense that they're both very atmospheric, both very kind of fairy tale, soft magic kind of stories, but I will say it also feels very different from Uprooted because of it's just much more wintry. Uprooted's much more kind of forest and earth-based, and then also I feel like this is a tighter story of just, again, female power and kind of how they're making a way in a difficult world, whereas that one, Uprooted, is more of a, I'd say it is heavier romance leanings and is more of a one POV focused, whereas this is multi-POV, so they do feel very different. If you've read Uprooted and didn't like it, I would say still give Spinning Silver a try. I did like it more than Uprooted personally. One common criticism that I have heard of this book is that it doesn't give you the character whose POV you're in at the start of the chapter or the break. It just has you kind of figure out whose head you're in based on context clues. Because I knew that going in, I didn't really struggle with that as much as I expected, because I think I was hyper aware and looking for those clues, but it is something that I have heard as a criticism before. And personally, I just think every book is better off with just having character names at the beginning of a break or a chapter. It's just a simple thing, and I feel like it makes it so much easier for the reader, but I personally didn't really have much issues with that. I gave this 4 stars. I think it's one of those books that I had such a great reading experience with, but it might not necessarily stay with me down the line. I just didn't connect with the characters on that sort of long-term favorite level, but I did have a really great time reading this. I read this because it was the Femmes Aficionados October-November book pick, and I will link our live show down below where we kind of discuss everything about this book if you want more detailed thoughts. But that was my second book for step 1, and this one checked off the royalty and the retelling prompts for me. For step 3, which was Find the Map to the Apple Tree, I read Furysong, which is the third and final book of the Aurelian cycle by Rosaria Munda. This has been an all-time favorite series for a long time now, pretty much since I read the first book. I immediately fell in love, and it's just been a 5-star series all around for me. I've loved it. I will say that I am a bit conflicted about this conclusion. I still don't really know what to rate this, and I think once I sit on it, I do think it probably will get like 4 or 4.5. It was not the story conclusion that I had been kind of led down the path of thinking I would get. And so it's not even just expectations of me going in, making my own expectations. I just feel like it kind of changed the trajectory of the entire series in a different way. So I'm just very conflicted. I think what this does is that it basically, there's 2 main characters in the series, Annie and Lee. And the first 2 books are both, it's kind of their story most of all. We have other POVs that are added on as we go into each book, but it's their story at the heart of it. And I think that this book kind of changes course on that and makes it as if it was Annie's story all along rather than Annie's and Lee's, and I wanted it to be both of theirs, if that makes sense. What the series is essentially a post-revolutionary setting where we had ruling families with dragons who kind of kept them in power, and instead the people rise up and overthrow these ruling kind of families. Lee's family was one of those ruling oligarchs, and he is witness to his entire family and everyone he knows being murdered. He ends up in an orphanage where he meets Annie, who is a serf and peasant of land that belonged to Lee's family originally. And so Annie has suffered through a lot of hardship at the hands of Lee's family, and they end up in an orphanage together and grow up together with this very difficult background. And one of the changes that this post-revolutionary society does is it makes dragon training and dragon riding available to anyone who is chosen by a dragon egg. And so both Annie and Lee are chosen, and we're kind of following them in dragon riding competitions at the beginning of the first book, which is Fireborn. My favorite thing about this series is that it very much looks at the complexity of revolutions and power and politics and how everything is much more grayer than it seems at first. There really isn't. You sympathize with every side. You're shown both how the prior society, the problems that it had, and then you're shown the problems of the post-revolutionary society, and how they're both very flawed, but at the same time, there are systems in place that do need to be challenged. It's just a very thoughtful, political kind of deep dive. That's my favorite thing about the series. And I also love the characters so much. I love Annie and Lee and kind of the different perspectives because of their backgrounds that you get and how they both fight to understand each other and clash because they don't. It's just really well written. This is a YA fantasy series. I don't think I've said that yet, but it is one that I've seen a lot of adult fantasy readers still enjoy because I think of the depth and kind of complexity it explores. So it's one that I would recommend to pretty much everyone to pick up. Although I said I'm conflicted about the finale, I think it was still a really strong finale. So take that with a grain of salt. Again, it's still going to be at least 4 stars for me. I still all around love the series. Like I said, my biggest struggle is that I feel like it becomes much more Annie's story, and I wanted it to be Annie's and Lee's. And then I also, some of the kind of emotional things, the way that Rosaria Munda wrote the first 2 books, just the sentences would emotionally wreck me. There were just things that just really, I felt deeply. And I didn't have as much of an experience of that with this one, although I did cry at least twice, I think 3 times. So there were emotions. It's just there weren't those quiet moments, and the characters felt a little bit kind of different than in the first 2 books, I would say. Annie and Lee's relationship with each other and kind of interactions felt a bit different as well. I can't really pinpoint why. So it just didn't have the same emotional impact, even though it still had a really strong emotional impact. That's why I'm so confused. It's so hard to talk about this because it's like it was a really strong book. It just wasn't quite the like blow my mind conclusion that I wanted and expected. But conclusions are just hard in general. I think that there's a lot that you kind of need to do in a conclusion, and it can be really tough to do it all and give everything the time it needs. The way that this series has made me think, and just the complexity and nuance and kind of it introduces, the questions it poses, the dragons, the amazing characters, it's definitely an all-time favorite series regardless, and I do recommend it to pretty much everyone. I think everyone should give it a go. This was a buddy read with one of my best friends, Mary Beth, and I always just have the best time buddy reading and discussing with her, so that was a really big highlight. And I read this for, like I said, step 2, and I read this for the recently acquired and orange, yellow, or brown on the cover. It also hit hard mode because I had 2 of the colors. We had brown and yellow and a bit of orange in the flames, which are kind of hard to see, but they're there. And this was also a series that I finished off, so that got me one of my Knock It Out November goals, and then also it was a physical TBR book that I checked off, so getting all the goals. Yay. For step 3, which was Gather Companions, I read A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland. This is a standalone fantasy romance book, and it does have a plot which is focused on this idea that this specific country is known for their money being super reliable, so their coins are really difficult to counterfeit, and that lends them reliability and trust in trade, and that is kind of the foundation of their country or kingdom. At the start of the book, counterfeit coins start showing up, and so there is an investigation. We follow 2 main characters. One is the prince of a royal family who has been kind of tasked with overseeing this investigation and getting to the bottom of this, but he's also under a lot of scrutiny for something that happens at the very start of the book. And then we have the other character who is a bodyguard brought in to protect the prince as part of his royal kind of protection service. These 2 characters start out with a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding between the 2 of them because the guard believes that the prince is responsible for the death of one of his fellow guards during a kind of incident, again, that happened at the beginning of the book. And so they kind of have to overcome that, and it is a male-male fantasy romance. I would caution anyone picking this up going in expecting a lot of plot, because to me this was very much a very, very minimal plot. Like, plot was like a sprinkle on top after you got through the character moments. It was very much focused on the relationship build up. What I loved about it was it was so slow burn that it wasn't the kind of slow burn where you start out with lust and then they slow burn to love. It was the kind of slow burn where they start out as not even friends, then they become friends through kind of long conversations and communication and trust, and then from there there's attraction building, and then a relationship develops. So it was very much a slow burn in a very kind of drawn out, natural way that I really enjoyed. This is pretty much kind of my ideal fantasy romance. I did give this 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. It was just, again, the right amount of focus on the relationship and the like conversations, then the trusting each other and loyalty and kind of overcoming their own differences and how they're very different people, but they grow to understand each other and respect each other, and I loved the way that that unfolded. I loved the side characters. There's one in particular that I thought would be kind of pigeonholed into the like ex trope, but he ends up being just, he has a lot more growth and dimension to him than expected, and he has some of the funniest, like he's the instigator of some of the funniest scenes. I loved him so much. And we have the prince's sister who plays a big role, and there's a lot of kind of family things that they're working through, and she's of course the queen, and so she has to manage both her duty and kind of her family ties. And we have really great anxiety rep, at least as someone who kind of suffers anxiety on a much lower level than what this character goes through. I still felt very seen in the way that it was written, so I thought that that was really well done. The prince suffers from panic attacks, which I don't personally have, thank goodness, so I can't speak to that part of the rep, but I thought that the anxiety generally felt very realistic to me. I'm very excited to hopefully read more of Alexandra Rowland next year, because I have heard that her other books are set in the same world as this, and if they're anything like this one, if they're the same kind of writing style and just really great focus on relationships and characters, I'm going to love them. I really enjoyed this. It was marketed to fans of the Goblin Emperor, and I will second that. I do see the connection. I think that this has even less plot than the Goblin Emperor does, but again, that wasn't negative for me personally. Just caution to anyone who does need more plot in their books. I think that this very much, that's not the main focus of this, but it gives me the same kind of vibes and relationship focuses as Goblin Emperor. So if you loved that, I do recommend picking this up as well. I'm also really happy I loved this because I did buy the broken binding, beautiful kind of special edition. I think this is one of the prettiest books that I have ever seen with the sprayed edges. I'm really happy that I have this now that I've loved it so much. And so we checked off another one on my physical TBR, and then it was a standalone, so no series. And it got me the prompts for featuring romance, featuring family, and new to me author. Step 4 was Quest for the Apple Tree, and for that one I read Godbreaker, which is the third and final book of the Black Coast series, which was called The God King Chronicles. So first book is Black Coast. The series starts out as a very kind of different take on adult fantasy, where instead of there being this kind of big battle and conflict, we have a very heavy focus on two different groups of people trying their best to actually achieve peace. And so basically at the beginning of the first book, the citizens of Blackkeep see that raiders are coming, and these raiders have always come and pillaged and destroyed their towns and killed their people. But then they find out that these raiders are actually coming there seeking asylum and are fleeing from a bigger threat. So because of the circumstances that both groups are in, they end up having to try and coexist and kind of live peacefully, and that's what the entire first book is focused on. We then delve into the larger threat that is what caused the raiders to come there in the first place as the series goes on, and we expand out into other POVs. It is multi-POV from the start, and we visit other locations where there are kind of political struggles going on and things like that. I'm giving this book 2.5 stars. I was not a fan of how the series ended. To be honest, I could have DNF'd at pretty much any point of it and been okay, because it was just, I felt like it was really not having the momentum that it needed to for a finale. The second book felt very much middle book syndrome to me, and that was my biggest problem with it. The first book had been 5 stars and I absolutely adored it. Again, second book was middle book syndrome. I was really hoping the conclusion would kind of kick things up again. And instead, at the beginning of this, our characters are all dealing with different threats. And I just think it took a long time to tie it all in together. And there's some POVs that didn't even tie in. They literally never tied into the rest of the story. They could have been taken out. They didn't affect the other POVs. They were just there as kind of more world building, which was interesting, but I think that I want the POVs to have more of an impact or more of a connection. They kind of felt extraneous at the end of this to me. I don't see why they were included, to be honest. And I think that this book should have been book 2, and then book 3 should have been where all the threads are finally connecting and all the people are kind of connecting to face this bigger threat, rather than all facing their own dilemmas in different locations and then slowly but not quite coming together. I just think that that wasn't plotted the way that it should have been for me, for my maximum enjoyment. And that was my complaint at the beginning of this. I just thought that it wasn't really having the momentum that it should have for a finale. And so I was just kind of bored and could have put it down. But then I pushed through, and in the last third, things started to make me actively mad. So it was sitting at like a 3.5, 3 stars book, where I just was like, it's fine. And then dumb decisions were made, if you ask me. So there was one specific thing that happens where the characters even say, yes, we know that doing this thing doesn't really make sense, because even if we do it, it'll have bad consequences and there really won't be much of a win for why we should do it. But we're going to do it anyway. I mean, they try to kind of explain, again, keeping it really vague and spoiler free, but like they try to explain why this character is doing the thing that they're doing. But it's a very weak explanation, if you ask me, because the like chances of it being helpful are very slim, and the chances of it being not helpful are very, very big. And so it was just it was like the author needed that character to do the thing and have the thing happen to them, and it just pissed me off. It was just a bad way to do it. Like, if that was going to be where that character's story went, there should have been more worth to it, more significance. And I feel like it was just done in a very insignificant way. So that really made me angry. And then again, I was just really mad that several of the POVs had absolutely nothing to do with anything in the general bigger story. They were just living their own happy life over there. And why was I reading about them in the first place? They were also the least interesting ones. So like, just take them out of there. The threats themselves, again, we didn't really all band together to face them until a good portion of this book. And then when we did, they seemed to at first be like this really difficult to overcome threat, and then someone overcomes it really easily. So just, there was a lot of plot kind of conveniences, things that weren't planned out or plotted as well as they should have been. It almost felt to me like the author had this really cool idea for the first book, and this kind of two cultures trying to peacefully coexist, but then ended up having more books and stretching it out into a bigger story, which just wasn't plotted as thoughtfully. I think that it had a lot of great ideas, but it could have used more thoughtful plotting, personally. That being said, I still really enjoy this author's writing, this author's world building. I really enjoy the characters, the POVs that we have, generally speaking. Most of them I did connect with. And when we had an epilogue that kind of hinted at a potential spin-off series, I was immediately like, well, I'm gonna have to read it. I'm intrigued, I wanna know, and I'm invested. So even though the series wasn't a big win for me, I still loved the first book and the world building, and I'm definitely gonna keep reading more from this author. This was a physical TBR book, so I checked that off. It was the conclusion of a series, so I checked that off. And then for the Once Upon a Readathon, it hit the book featuring magic prompt, which I didn't expect it to, and then it got bonus points for kind of how things went about in this one, as well as the historical prompt, the over 300 pages prompt, and then the hard mode version of that for over 450 pages. And then for step 5, which was Climb the Apple Tree, I read The Jade Setter of Janloon by Fonda Lee. This is a prequel novella to the Greenbone Saga world, but is a completely standalone novella. You have characters that pop in here from the other series, but you can read it without having read Greenbone Saga. And I am absolutely obsessed with Greenbone Saga. If you're new to my channel or I haven't talked about it enough, that series lives in my heart deeply. I can't stop thinking about it, and being back in this world was just as wonderful as I thought it would be, honestly. I love the characters. I love the way Fonda Lee writes. I love this world. I want more in there. I should probably subscribe to her Patreon so I can get all the behind the scenes stuff that she's put out about this world, because that's how obsessed I am with it. Greenbone Saga has this magic system where on the specific island of Kekon, they have an affinity to use Jade. And so wearing Jade will give them certain special kind of powers or abilities. People from outside of Kekon do not have the same affinity for Jade, and it can actually cause Jade sickness, which causes them to go mad. So there's kind of a lot of power struggles over this magical source that this island has and that other countries don't have. In Jade Setter of Janloon, we follow a Jade Setter who will put the Jade into, for example, necklaces or rings or watches or whatever the people need in order to wear it and harness it. The Jade Setter is operating outside of any specific clan authority, so there are clans in the Greenbone Saga that are kind of at war with each other, and the Jade Setter here is trying to keep his allegiances neutral. We follow his apprentice, so it's actually through the POV of the apprentice, and the apprentice has a lot of ambitions. He wants his Jade Setter mentor to expand, and he wants him to choose a clan and kind of use the power and influence that would give him to expand and make this more of a kind of bigger business and things like that. So he's pushing his mentor to do that. At the beginning of the story, we have a theft that occurs with someone's very important Jade object, and our apprentice and everyone involved in this shop have to try and get this item back before it's revealed that it's missing and before innocent people suffer the consequences. I gave this 5 stars. Again, I just loved being back in this world. I loved seeing familiar faces. I'm really happy with who we saw pop up. And then I also just really enjoyed the characters that are newly introduced in this. Just overall a really great reading time. And this one checked off a physical book on my TBR. It's a standalone, so no series goals there. And it got me the conflict prompt, so book featuring a conflict, the book featuring a morally great character, and then also it was a poll pick. So those are all of my Once Upon a Readathon reads. I had a really great reading month, like I said. I have pretty much almost all 4 or 5 stars across the board with the exception of 1 book, and overall I managed to get a lot of books off of my goals that I wanted to. So big thank you to Hannah for having me as part of your Readathon team hosts, and thank you to Cassidy for inspiring me to kind of check off some of my goals. If you participated in Once Upon a Readathon, let me know how you did and what your favorite book of the month was. If you didn't, just let me know in general how your reading month went and what your favorite read was, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.